Welcome, everybody. This is our first episode ever of GammaCast. And on the show today, first off, I'm Dave, and I have got Charlie on with me. Say hi, Charlie.
Hello.
And what we're going to do is we're going to have a regular co-host named Chris. He wasn't able to join us tonight, so this is kind of our meet the hosts for our podcast. Of what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing the Incredible Hulk TV show from 1978 to 1982 is when it was aired originally. But what we're going to do is we're going to watch each episode on Netflix, and then we're going to do our review on it.
Mr. McGee, don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry.
You are about to listen to the Totally Super Awesome 80s Reboot Overdrive podcast.
This podcast is our fan tribute to the Incredible Hulk TV show. Be advised that has been exposed to radiation and we caution to listen at your own risk. You have now entered GammaCast.
Yes, I'm very excited about this. I actually, very big fan of the old 80s show.
Okay.
The only thing that's a little disappointing to me is that I don't think we're going to be able to get to any of the movies on Netflix. So I don't think Trial of the Incredible Hulk or The Incredible Hulk Returns are currently on Netflix. But
all right. I'm very curious to see how well this is received. Because obviously it's an older show. But something that I've been able to tap into with the 80s Reboot Overdrive podcast is, there's a lot of people that dig the nostalgia stuff. So I'm really curious to see, if this podcast will, have, some good attention on it. I'm excited about it, really.
Well, yeah. Well, if nothing else, when people listen to it, it reminds them of the show, and then it gives them a desire to go back and go watch the shows. I've been listening to There Are Four Lights podcast, and it gets me geeked about watching old Star Trek: The Original Series again.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, there's these retro casts are very good, and you think about anything on Netflix is by its nature a retro cast. So whether they're doing Daredevil or Jessica Jones, I'm already, I'm done with, I'm all ready to get through it. But I'm enjoying, reading the reviews online and going back and re-engaging with it because it's still a lot of fun. So
you've already watched Jessica?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
I haven't even started it, but I loved Daredevil. Oh, that one was fantastic.
Daredevil is a lot more action centric. Jessica's a bit more talky. It has some great suspense. Jessica is much more of a thriller, I'd say, whereas Daredevil is much more of your traditional action film. It's an action film. Jessica is much more psychological, which is by its nature. The Purple Man is a psychological villain. He's not a guy, he's not a guy that you punch because, he can't punch. He has no, you punch him and he's out. He's a glass jaw villain. He's not going to be able to engage with you in a hand-to-hand fight. Unlike the Kingpin, who is very much a power broker and a manipulative, but still, quite frankly, if you throw down with him, he's going to clean your clock because he is just a giant,
Right. How did you feel about the Daredevil movie that had Ben Affleck?
I was not opposed to it. It was, here's the thing. If you're a guy of a certain age, and you grew up on Lou Ferrigno and Reb Brown, and the guy who played Doctor Strange, you have a slightly higher tolerance for these kinds of things.
True.
I did not think it was bad. I thought their depiction. I mean, honestly, what I would say, the weirdest thing about it was probably their depiction of Bullseye. I didn't think that their depiction of Elektra was particularly bad. I thought that the actual Elektra movie, suffered from in a lot of ways, but not. None of them suffered from their actors. I think sometimes the stories got a little out of their warehouse, but the Ben Affleck Daredevil wasn't bad. It made its money back. It wasn't, I don't know what people wanted from it, but I kind of feel like it. I kind of feel like everyone was going to be disappointed by it, regardless, because it was not. I think when you make a comic book adaptation movie or television show or anything like that, you're always going to run into these walls.
Right.
And to that extent, that's actually one of the reasons I kind of think that the Incredible Hulk as a thing, in the fact that they just tossed out the comic book, I mean, just threw it right out the window, and allowed them to kind of make their own thing. I think that in many ways that's sometimes better, in the sense that so long as you commit to making something good, even if you make your own thing, people are going to enjoy it.
Okay.
And that's the thing about the Incredible Hulk. And of course, I don't know if we're recording yet, but we can go over all this again. The Incredible Hulk series, it's nothing to do with the comic book, and yet became iconic among comic book fans. And you think about that you always get all this, ranting and raving about, oh, the nerds are going to say, oh, you're this and you're that, and you didn't follow the comic book exactly like we wanted to. And yet here is something which, like I said, threw the comic book out the window, and yet still wound up being a darling of the entire nerd set,
Right.
There was no nerd who said, oh no, the Incredible Hulk was horrible. No, they also know it was good. It was something completely different. It wasn't, Dr. Banner pelted by gamma rays turns into the Hulk. It was, it was its own thing. It was, Dr. David Banner, physician, scientist, a man trying to tap into the hidden strength that all humans have.
Yeah, so you look at it as kind of like a whole different animal, and if you look at it that way and you don't expect it to be part of the regular continuity, then you enjoy it more. And
I think that is what I think Marvel has tapped into with its MCU very much. Because the MCU doesn't necessarily follow the books. I mean, they'll do some shout outs to the book, and they'll do some references to ideas in the book, but by and large, they do make their own stories, they make their own characters, and they create their own histories. And in doing so, they have endeared themselves to the geekerati, where the people of nerddom and of the mainstream say, hey, this is a cool story, because it's a good story. And it's well thought out, and it's well presented. And at the end of the day, it's not about either overly embracing or overly rejecting the comics. It's about telling a good story within the concept of the character. When you start out, the story is Dr. Banner is a scientist who gets exposed to gamma rays and turns into the Hulk. That is your one-line synopsis of the Hulk. And there is no difference between saying that for the TV series, saying that for any of the movies, or saying that for the comic books. It's always Dr. Banner is a scientist exposed to gamma rays, turns into the Hulk.
Right.
And if you had
to give a very brief synopsis of him, that's all you have to say. And for those of us that are familiar with the character, it's the Hulk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, I really don't want to waste all this good stuff.
and by the way, it automatically starts recording when I connect via Skype, so I'm getting all this.
So I must say, really and truthfully, you may find that one thing I'm known for on Southgate Media is my ability to just talk about anything Marvel related for for a long period of time. So,
That's why I think you're perfect for this, because I'm looking at it from kind of the nostalgic 80s perspective. And I think you're going to be able to bring to this podcast a better in-depth understanding of the Marvel Universe, which I'm really excited to hear about.
Yeah, well, because what's great about this is, and this is something that's of course very, to me, it's one of the beauties of genre story go around that is the superhero stories, is that even when something is good or bad, good things can influence it, and there are aspects of the Hulk TV series that went on to become part of the general, Marvel Hulk, because people liked it. They said, no, that's the way we want to explore the Hulk, and that's how I'd like to go see it. And of course, that wasn't new to the Hulk. I mean, that actually goes back to the Superman radio serials, where so many things that we think of as iconic about Superman actually came from the ancillary products and then filtered their way into the comic books, rather than being from the comic books out. And I think that's sort of that's that mistaken notion about this genre, is that it's the comic books out, and actually no, it's an interaction between all of the stories and all of the variations on it. And when you're writing superhero stories, they are, by their nature, this ongoing tale told by numerous people in numerous different ways, and one does not necessarily relate to the other, but they all influence each other as they go on out. And
okay. Well, then, luckily we're recording, because I'm curious about this. Is there anything in the TV show that influenced what happened in the comic book?
Well, I think one of the things that very much came to influence him is that I think Dr. Banner in many ways became just that Dr. Banner became an actual medical doctor as well as a physicist. I think that is the current standard storyline with him, is that he's got these multiple degrees, one of which is an MD. But the actual psychological aspect of it, I think, went on to influence him greatly. There's an entire story about child abuse in the 80s Hulk thing that, of course, later came back and became very influential in the Hulk storyline. The idea that, David, well, in this case, David Banner, not Bruce Banner, which is actually, I can go a whole hour on talking about why Bruce Banner is not Bruce Banner, and things like, but
and that might be a good episode 1.
Yes, but
I think this is episode 0.
Yeah, so episode 0, I'm very happy to be here on episode 0. One of the things that I kind of think is most interesting in the way that they've approached, I think that the TV series, and in many ways, and here's what I'll tell you, is that the Hulk TV series very much is the foundation of the current MCU, because it takes the fantastical idea, but it makes it a point to ground it in a seemingly realistic. I don't like to say realistic, because it's not really realistic. It's seemingly realistic scientific world. When Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with these ideas, and they're coming up with the radiation, and they're calling it gamma rays, and they're calling it cosmic rays, but these are just sort of words that they're picking out of the ether. They opened it up and they say, "Oh, gamma rays." Okay, we'll say it's gamma rays because they've already used cosmic rays. So what's the next thing we can use? Oh, we'll call them gamma rays, even though actually a main component of cosmic rays is actually gamma radiation.
But yeah, no, I had heard that similar, that Stan Lee just kind of threw that out because he liked the way it sounded.
Yeah, but of course, once you go into the television series, then it actually has to be actual gamma radiation. And of course, one of the big things, which is actually kind of interesting in its own tie-in to the Fantastic Four, is that what Dr. Banner notices is that these great adrenal feats of strength tend to be related to periods of time with high solar flare activities. Again, tying it to the real gamma radiation, the real cosmic radiation that becomes that feeds into the narrative. And I mean, that is very much the structure of the MCU in that same way. Is of the way that it's structured. It is this idea of taking these very real ideas, and we're going to play with them just enough so that they fit into our magical reality of the superhero genre, but they are going to seem close enough to reality that you're going to see them and you're going to say, oh yeah, this is totally believable within our suspension of disbelief.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's and like I said, and that is, and I really think in many ways these 1970s and 80s stories, whether you're talking about Red Brown's Captain America, which is essentially discussing a super steroid, or the Incredible Hulk, it's this idea of how do we take what is inherently fantastical, but bring it into a live action video structure. And so you get, your Lou Ferrigno Hulk and your Red Brown Captain America, etc., who fit into this system nicely, even though they are very much, not the superheroes, from the paper, from the books, but in their own way, a more believable and realistic superhero, much in the way that the MCU now is just that. It is a much more believable and realistic variation on the superheroes, even as they, pay tribute to the original source material.
Right.
We'll return after these messages.
It started as a nuclear experiment, and now David Banner is a man alone, pursued by danger and fear. Because whenever he is angered, the unleashed rage transforms him. Will David find a cure to control the Incredible Hulk?
Friday night at 8 on TV8.
In fact, Charlie, something I didn't tell you is that recently, with the whole thing going on with Star Wars lately, what I've done is I actually rewatched the holiday special. I don't know if you've ever put yourself through the torture of watching that.
Torture? I watched that when it premiered and was so joyfully excited to celebrate Life Day with my fellow Wookiees. It was... what's funny about it is, of course, I'm a little, because I was born in 1974, and I think that came out in
79, I believe.
79, yeah. So yeah. I'm a 5-year-old kid who is just aware of Star Wars and is so excited to be watching this film or this television show, because it was for the kids, and it was wonderful. And what's funny about it is years later you have this memory, and this of course is before the internet. You have this memory of this thing, of this Star Wars Christmas special that, as near as you can tell, has been wiped from the face of history.
Yes. I think it's kind of like the black hole for George Lucas. He wants to rid any kind of remembrance of that particular special. But the reason why I bring it up is just that I decided, because we were just doing a podcast where we're talking about our memories of kind of the Star Wars extra stuff outside of the movies. And as I was watching it on YouTube, I realized it had been preempted by The Incredible Hulk. And I thought, that was really kind of funny, because it was a nice tie-in to what it is that we're going to be talking about. So my 80s Reboot Overdrive Star Wars podcast kind of bleeds over to, The Incredible Hulk.
Well, speaking of, because one of the things we were discussing is how some things that can be kind of looked down upon, how they can even wind up influencing the source material itself. Of course, the great wonderment of the Star Wars Holiday Special is that it's the first appearance of Boba Fett.
Yes.
And of course, Boba Fett actually gets to do something and actually appears somewhat capable as a bounty hunter in that episode. And
right.
it's a very fascinating aspect of it because, of course, usually, when you think about Boba Fett, when you think about just in the movies, he doesn't do much. Although I always made the joke, it was that great reveal when they present that all the stormtroopers are actually clones of Jango Fett, of whom Boba Fett is also a clone of. And that explains why the stormtroopers can't hit anything when they fire. Jango Fett just really wasn't that good as a bounty hunter either. And neither was Boba Fett, and neither were the stormtroopers. And
right.
They just he looked cool, and that's why they cloned him for the stormtroopers. But not that this is a Star Wars podcast, but
No, I was just relating it to the previous podcast, but I thought it was just funny that as I was watching it on YouTube, it showed this is going to be shown in place of the Incredible Hulk, and I just thought that was funny because I guess when I had originally viewed the holiday special, I didn't remember that fact that we were missing the Incredible Hulk because the holiday special was on. Charlie, if you can I know that you're really into the history of the Marvel Universe, and you also do a couple things for Southgate Media with it. Can you tell our listeners about kind of the podcast that you're on and what you're doing with, I guess, dabbling into the Marvel Universe?
Yes. Well, as I was saying, I started off with a little blog for on Southgate Media for Rob called Super Connectivity, which eventually expanded into its own podcast called Super Connectivity on the Nuff Said feed, which is a very wide-ranging discussion that I have once a week with Philip Parrish, my intrepid co-host who puts up with me in that show. And we basically go discuss everything, actually Marvel related, which includes now Disney and Star Wars. So I've found ways to incorporate those bits of nerddom into it as well.
Any way you can connect those buttons, yes.
Yeah, anyway, and that was the original idea behind Super Connectivity, is finding how everything connects together. And of course, I also, for the more current things, Phil and I also do the all-new Marvel Roundup once a week, where we take our Wednesday books, we read them, and then we discuss them. And for Marvel, these are Marvel books, and discuss them and rate them and discuss what is great or what is wrong with the Marvel Universe right now and its comic book franchises. Yeah, and that's what I do. And I am known for waxing very deeply and philosophically about the Marvel Universe, which is why on my other podcast they call me Charlie the Professor Esser.
Philosophical and Marvel. Love it.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, Marvel gets very philosophical. All stories get philosophical. Any story written was written by a guy who said, I want to say something. I have something that I think is important enough to say. And whether that was someone who was writing Animal House or Citizen Kane or the Incredible Hulk TV series, whatever they're writing to say something. Because if you didn't have something to say, you wouldn't write it down. And so there's always, even on things that are very superficial, there's usually something deeper to it, something that is intrinsic to the story. To wax it back to Star Wars, George Lucas didn't set out to write the hero's journey, the hero's tale that Joseph Campbell eventually, said, but he touched into this, ancient zeitgeist of storytelling that really presented something that became universal. And I think that is true in virtual to not everything that you write is going to be Star Wars, not everything is going to be so good as Star Wars in that telling of that tale, but every tale has that basic feeling of mythos to it.
Right.
And of course the Incredible Hulk is incredibly primal to that. It has the Dr. Frankenstein aspect of man, which is really the both the Prometheus story and the Icarus story. It's the idea of man's reach being further than his grasp, that mankind wants something, but he doesn't understand the ramifications of it. So he flies too close to the sun. He gives things that are not meant for humanity away that eventually lead to humanity, or at least the individual's own destruction. These are very basic stories, and this is the story of, in no matter how you present it, is the story of the Hulk. It is of the scientist who unleashes something that he was trying to get to. When you think about the original comic book, he's building a bomb. And when he's caught in the bomb, he actually becomes a bomb himself. In the TV series, Dr. David Banner is trying to, tap into the hidden strengths that all humans have. But, he does in fact tap into that hidden strength that all humans have. But he realizes once he's tapped into that strength, the strength becomes more powerful than him. And he becomes this being outside of himself that is what he was trying to do, but he didn't realize what the ramifications of it were. And that is, of course, this is a very classic tale. Like I say, it's Icarus, it's Prometheus, it is a person who dreams himself more than his station, and then even though he achieves great things, may also be humbled by his overreach. The Perseus story, again, similarly, wanting to ascend to Olympus and being cast down in the end because, he is a great man, but he is no god. Which, of course, then ties into, if you really want to get into it, into our more modern variations on the Hulk mythos and his own tortured relationship with the Asgardians.
Wow.
Yes.
That is just way, way deep. And that's awesome.
Well, this is what you get when you invite Charlie Esser on a podcast.
For our listeners, what I want you to know is that, me being the 80s reboot Overdrive guy is just that, I'm into this because of the nostalgic of the TV show. I remember, I remember seeing it as a kid, but I don't remember a lot of the actual details of it. So I'm so excited to be, rewatching the episodes and then being able to just talk about it. And then, especially with Charlie here, because you get to give me kind of a more in-depth look at, how it, it's going to influence, the Marvel Universe in general, or maybe a little in-depth, a little more in-depth story that, I didn't realize by just being a casual viewer. So I'm thinking this is really going to be a good yin and yang kind of take on the podcast. Because, I'm looking at this because, I remember watching it, and I remember, loving the fact that, we had Bill Bixby, kind of the lonely man, the loner, because, he was trying to avoid, hurting anybody because he realized he became this monster. And then you have the great Lou Ferrigno, and it is just wonderfully, 80s nostalgic, very $6 Million man kind of thing going on. I'm very excited to, watch these episodes and then be able to talk on them and be able to compare notes with, Charlie and obviously Chris when he's on.
Well, as I was saying earlier, when you break it down, this was the first time that Marvel had a real success. outside of the comics. Its cartoons were about as successful as any cartoons were,
Right.
but this was their first time where they really hit something that captured the popular imagination. And in many ways, as we'll go into, I think that this is really the start of what we think of as the MCU. That the Incredible Hulk series is this, and I think in many ways kind of just sort of lucked into being this Formula 4 that we see in the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is this idea that, we're going to take the basic premise of the comics, but we're going to not worry so much about being exactly like the comics, while at the same time try to translate what is an inherently fanciful idea from the comics into a more solid, I don't want to say scientific, because it's not scientific in any definition of the word science. It is in many ways a child's understanding of science, but bringing it into a level of believability with implausible suspension of disbelief that you can flow with it and it seems real enough for a show. And that, I think, really gets its first solid structure here in The Incredible Hulk. As we discussed earlier, comic book geeks and really fandom culture in general gets this really strong, really undeserved, I'll say, rap about obsession about relation to the source material. Here we have something in The Incredible Hulk, something that throws the source material nearly completely out the window, and yet gets embraced by the fan culture, despite the fact that it really is its own thing. It's its own variation on the theme. And I think that this is maybe what people miss about fan culture's worry about separation from the source material. I don't think that fan culture gets upset about separation from the source material just for the sake of separation from the source material, but because you separate from the source material and didn't tell a good story. That if you want to tell a good story, if you want to make a good show, and to do that, you have to separate from the source material. I think that geeks and nerds and fans of all stripes say, okay, we'll allow it. Sort of like the judge when the lawyer goes off on a tangent and says, I'm going to allow it. We allow it because we want to see where you're going. We want to see what it's going to be. But, if you don't deliver, if you're going to break from genre, if you're going to break from the tradition of the story just to break it, just to say, well, we're going to do our own thing, but then you don't deliver with something good, then people are going to say, well, why did you do that? I think this is, you can see this with the most recent Fantastic Four film as well, where, they break from, where it's actually interesting because they follow certain aspects of at least the Ultimates version pretty directly, but then they break with other things. But, I don't think that either that when they were close to the story or when they broke from the story was what was important in that film. What was important was that they didn't tell a good story. And it doesn't matter how close you are to the story, if you don't tell a good story, it's not going to be a good story. The details of the genre are irrelevant to why people like the stories. People like the stories because they're good.
So the Incredible Hulk is accepted as kind of into the fandom of the Incredible Hulk mythos because they were good stories. The 78 to 82 TV series we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. People liked them, and at their and in their core, what they got right was what was important. They got right the idea of Dr. Banner being this tortured soul, being this person with this beast within him that he can't control, and having to deal with both the guilt and, in its own way, the attraction of being a superpowered being. I think it's Don Glover. as a stand-up comedian. I believe it was Don Glover, although it might be another comedian as well. And he was talking about his fascination with the Hulk. But at some point as a kid, he realized that every week the Hulk goes somewhere, or Bruce Banner goes somewhere and gets into a fight, and he becomes the Hulk. And at a certain point, he realized as a young man that, if you get into a fight every week, it's not the world, it's you. You're doing something that's picking fights. And to some extent, when you think about David Banner, he does get himself into all these sorts of troubles. For a man who's ostensibly trying to avoid trouble, he gets into a lot of it. And part of that, I think, is that perhaps, when you're dealing with monstrous characters, there is this, even when you find a cure, you always go back to being the monster, because even though you dislike the monster, even though you want to be cured, you always want the advantages of being the monster. Whether you're Ben Grimm, who, in the second, because I do count Roger Corman Fantastic Four, the second, where he gets cured, and then, but now I got to go become the Thing again so we can defeat Doctor Doom, and which is a wonderful little excuse to why I have to become the Thing again. But at the end of the day, there's a part of you that always wants to be the Thing. There's a part of David Banner that wants to be the Hulk, which is why I think in so many stories, in the comic books at least, it's always this idea of David Banner saying, but what if I could keep my mind and be the Hulk? What if I could merge the two and then be this brilliant scientist and be the super strong guy who could accomplish such great things?
Right. Like you mentioned, like the Fantastic Four, where he was no longer the Thing, but then he had to make that conscious choice to say, yeah, you know what? No, I do want to be able to be the Thing in order to, for the greater good. And then that would happen. The same thing that's going to happen with David Banner, right? If he would find the ability to not be the Hulk, but something is going to influence the decision where there's a bad guy that he has to beat, he's going to choose to continue to be this thing that he didn't choose to be at the beginning, but still be the Incredible Hulk in this case in order to defeat them, because it's for the greater good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it is, and that is the inherent conflict of being a superhero. It's one of the things, I bring up this idea. I've brought up this idea a couple times. To me, the first superhero story. Well, really, the first superhero story is kind of is of course the Song of Gilgamesh. Another version I like to turn to also is Jason and the Argonauts. But in both cases, what you really have is this idea that someone has great power, either through an adventure or something, and yet everything kind of turns to dross at the end. It's like, I have this power, but that does not prevent me from enduring tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. What I always say about Jason and the Argonauts, why that's kind of, to me, the first superhero story, is because the story of Jason kind of starts with just a random occurrence. He gets smiled upon by the goddess Hera, and so now he becomes this blessed man who goes on these grand adventures. But, just being blessed with these grand adventures actually leads him down this path that leads to his ultimate destruction and essentially leads to madness. And in many ways, that is the story of most of our most popular superheroes. Whether it's the Hulk or Spider-Man, they have these great powers, but really the powers kind of screw up their lives because they can never have just a normal day. They can never have a normal life. There was a kind of a controversial point in the most recent Avengers film when, Banner and the Black Widow are talking, and Banner makes this point about how he can never give her a stable life. And, people said, well, why did people think that Black Widow wants a stable life? And what I took from that wasn't just that, oh, we can never have kids. His statement was, we can never have sex.
Right.
We can never actually go beyond the most platonic hand-holding of a relationship, because if my heart rate goes over, if my blood pressure rises above X amount, I'm going to become a gigantic green monster, and I will break you in half.
Right.
You're a tough lady, Natasha, but you ain't Hulk strength. And that's the thing, and that's what he was saying there, more than what people dwelled on. And of course, it got dwelled on because Natasha kind of stumblingly makes the point about how, well, she can't even have kids. And it's like, but Banner's point was, it's not even about having kids. It's about the fact that,
I would hurt you too much, or break you, or kill you. And I'm not in the position where I want to deal with that. So that's kind of the problem with that.
Which, of course, from Banner's perspective, is that ultimate excuse,
Right.
I mean, when you think about it, if you look at the psychology of the concept of the Hulk, it's this idea of, it's this ultimate way to keep people away. If Hulk always wants to be alone, as to go from the comic books. It's this idea of, it's this great excuse for why you can never be a part of society, why you can never be in the middle of things. I don't know if and this, of course, very much informs, the way that we see the Hulk in the series. I mean, although it maybe is not put such a fine point on it as it is in the comics, David Banner is always moving away. He's always running away.
Right.
And when you think about it, his motivation for running away is maybe not the strongest. The world thinks he's dead, and they blame the Hulk for killing these people. Really, at the end of the day, he faked his own death. And in faking his own death, which is no spoiler, that's the premise of the series. He fakes his own death, and he becomes separated from the world. And yes, he's trying to find a cure, ostensibly, but, he's also living on the road and being separate from humanity. And maybe one can argue that as a big brain guy, he kind of wants to be separate. He wants to be away from everything. And, that's the advantage of being the Hulk, is that you never have to actually have that closeness with another human being, because you have this built-in excuse as to why. Because I have the Hulk, and the Hulk prevents me from being with another person, but maybe that's what I wanted the whole time anyway.
Right. And, the struggle, for every episode, I'm sure, is just coping with that, because everything inside of him wants to be with somebody or be a part of something. But, by the nature of being the Hulk, the whole thought process is, I'm going to separate myself and be a loner.
Yes. Well, I guess that would be the conflict is
right.
This question. Is that really, is it really the Hulk who wants to be alone, or is it David Banner who wants to be alone?
Right.
And, and I think that numerous times throughout the series, Banner has the option to just stop, to explore something solid and real where he's at. And, because Jack McGee's on his tail, he has to keep on moving. But if we, it's always this problem when you discuss a fictional character, because when you're dealing with a fictional character, he has to keep moving because that's the story.
Right. Right. If he just stopped and puts down roots and he lives in a house with a white picket fence, then it's kind of like, okay, then we got a sitcom on our hands.
Yeah, well, then the story ends. Exactly. It's not the progression of the story, but at the same time, that he doesn't do this informs, essentially, in order for the story to have an existence where he doesn't put down roots, we have to say there is in his nature a desire to not put down those roots. Because what's preventing him from doing so is in the story. It's in the story. Well, it's like a lot of it's like a lot of stories. That if you're going to have the character not take the obvious choice, you then have to acknowledge the fact, at least on some level, that the obvious choice is being rejected because there's something deeper to the psychology of the character that makes them want to do the difficult choice.
Right.
Although, and of course, what one can make the strong argument with the Hulk is that actually doing the obvious choice, the easy, what to you and I is the easiest choice because we don't have a Hulk, is actually the difficult choice because it's very difficult to actually just be a human being and live a human life and go day to day with someone and have to deal with the emotions of interaction. Whereas if you're Dr. David Banner and you have the Hulk and Jack McGee always keeping you at bay, well, then you never have to deal with human emotions that last more than an episode.
Right.
You can always just move on to the next story. Just go start hitchhiking down the road. And speaking about your 80s reboot, man, people hitchhiking, that is so not something that exists anytime past 1992.
This is a good point.
That so much of this story is sort of, it's that inherent, interesting aspect of how aspects of the superhero genre that, of course, dates from the 30s and the 40s sort of hits these walls as we expand out. When Superman first, changed in a phone booth, the phone booths were made of wood, so you actually couldn't see it. Then years later, they still haven't changed in a phone booth, but now phone booths are made of glass. It doesn't really make much sense why a phone booth is a place for Superman to change his clothing. And likewise,
which was one of the most classic scenes from the original Superman movie, was when Clark Kent's running up to the phone booth and then he sees, that it's like, glass, or it's like a half booth.
Yeah.
Then he's like, he has to run away to change somewhere else, down the alley.
So
that was totally a classic scene because of that, the change in, what was the original concept versus what became, modern day times, influencing, those, how those stories conveyed. But I think it's important for us to at least give a little bit of the origin as to how we got to this point. And something that I don't know if you're aware of, Charlie, or not, is that, the idea got floated out on 80s Reboot Overdrive is, let's take a look at, TV shows that are on Netflix currently, and maybe, take a look at, watching one of those one of those specific TV shows and doing a podcast about it. So there was a lot of great things that are on Netflix right now that are 80 shows, and we're talking MacGyver, we're talking A-Team, we're talking Knight Rider. So what I actually ended up doing was putting a poll out to on Facebook and on our Twitter, and having people vote on which one that they would like to have us do a show on, and Incredible Hulk won, and that's kind of where we ended up, and I'm that's why I'm so glad that we're doing this now.
Yeah, well, it's quite frankly, it's a great show, and I think it does absolutely hit into that early 80s nostalgia, because this is it's really a late 70s, early 80s show, because it hits that end of the 70s and sort of the 80s, which was a very transitional time in American history and American culture. It was just, we were entering the Reagan era, we were leaving the Carter era, which was in its own way a reaction to the Nixon era, and it hit our culture at just the right time of transition. And it is a story of transition. It's a story about moving away from a a world we once knew and going out to explore the nation. And really, that's what it is. Really, The Incredible Hulk in its own way is kind of like Easy Rider with a superhero, which of course is ironic since in Easy Rider, the characters' names were Captain America and Bucky.
Good point.
Little known fact about Easy Rider. Well, maybe not little known, but it's very much that idea, and of course became so influential. And when we think about so many stories that came after, when you look at Knight Rider, when you look at A-Team, it's that same idea of here are our characters, and now they're going to travel the nation. Now they're going to travel the country and meet people along the way and solve problems. And of course, that does get older than that. Of course, it goes back to The Fugitive, and before that, I believe a show called The Millionaire, I think, was the first time where they had a guy doing that, where he was just traveling the country solving problems. In that case, he was just a millionaire with a flying car who had $1 million and liked to solve people's problems, which sort of Batman, but without so much punching.
But you're right. You tap into a interesting scenario there where you've got, this is pretty much a lot like the A-Team, right? Where they've got, the soldiers of fortune, and they're kind of staying underground. They're trying to help people, but they're being hunted. And we had the same theme here with the Incredible Hulk. So that is a very interesting, parallel.
Yeah, and of course, with David Banner, you've got both a handsome guy like Face, a smart guy like Hannibal, and then in the Hulk, you've got a strong guy and a crazy guy. So there you go. It's the whole A-Team in one character.
It is. We just give him a blowtorch and some sheet metal so that it's bulletproof.
Yes,
we're there.
Exactly. So for our first introductory podcast, how long do you want to go on this?
Honestly, I think we're good.
Yes.
It's actually been such a great conversation.
I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to when we can actually talk about the individual episodes. I'm really excited for it.
Yeah. So I guess that's what's next for us, right? Is watching our, watching the first episode that's on Netflix, and then regrouping, hopefully with Chris, and just being able to, dig deep and talk about it.
Now, I think the first episode is a two-parter. Do we want to just watch the first half?
Yes.
Or do you want to watch? Okay, so we're going to watch episode 1, and then we'll come back later and talk episode 2.
Right.
Okay, sounds good.
Sounds great. So usually how I end the podcast is, I ask, how do people find you on social media?
Well, you can always find me on Twitter at Charlie Esser. That's CharlieEsser. Look for the 2 E's in the middle because that means quality. And they can always write to me on the emails at superconnectivityblog@gmail.com. That's superconnectivityblog@gmail.com. And of course, always tune into the Superconnectivity podcast and the all-new Marvel Roundup.
Cool. And I'm Dave, and I take care of the 80s Reboot Twitter account, so that's at 80s Reboot. We're also on Tumblr, which is 80sreboot.tumblr.com. And if you ever get a chance to email us, it's at 80sreboot@gmail.com. So a lot of great ways to contact Charlie or myself. So please take advantage. And we are so looking forward to just, getting our gamma radiation on and hulking out. So with that, good night.
Good night.
We hope you've enjoyed this show. This podcast is part of the 80s Reboot Overdrive channel on Southgate Media Group. You can follow us on Facebook on the 80s Reboot group page. We're also on Twitter and Tumblr at 80s Reboot. We invite you to check out all the wonderful podcasts and blogs available at southgatemediagroup.com. And thank you for reliving the 80s.